As I was diving deep into the rot hole trying to find ideas for videos that I actually want to make, I once again on Twitter witnessed the ever so prevalent slander against what I consider to be a pretty overhated episode of Family Guy, which is Brian is a bad father. Many even consider it to be one of the worst of the series. Now, I'm not super into Modern Family Guy. Generally, I just think it's boring and creatively bankrupt, certainly not something I would watch even casually. Nevertheless, I've always felt pretty salty towards everyone's hatred towards this episode in particular, and it largely has to do with a specific controversial joke which I'll address later in the video. I think Brian's a bad father is fitting enough to be called underrated. I think it's pretty funny. There are many jokes that make me laugh out loud no matter how many times I hear. Not every joke is good, but this is a sentiment that applies to all episodes of Family Guy. This one at least had enough jokes to make up for a mostly positive experience, especially during the Peter and Quagmire subplot, which is my personal favorite. Now, a common complaint I've heard in the past is the lack of justification for why Peter decided to shoot Quagmire, and even afterwards, it was only until the end of the episode where he felt remorseful enough to want to reconcile with Quagmire in a fair way. Now, for one thing, I would like to point out that there is actually a reason for why Peter shot Quagmire. He wanted to show that his shotgun had the safety on. Sure, he didn't have to shoot him to prove that it was previously unloaded, but in his defense, it did kind of prove his point. Now, look, I'm not saying he was right in doing that. Obviously, he was wrong and that was a stupid thing to do. But we're talking about Peter Griffin here. He's done moronic shit like this so many goddamn times that at this point, this doesn't surprise me in the slightest. It's also possible he did it because he was mildly pissed off at Quagmire for pestering him about the safety being on, although that's a little more debatable. Also worth noting that later on, Peter did say that he apologized for what he had done, and given how Quagmire, before he decided to sever his relationship with Peter, he seemed to have exploded as if he was harboring a lot of rancor for similar things Peter had done in the past. I think it's safe to say that one of the reasons why Peter wasn't as remorseful as he should have been was because he had grown to be complacent over his reckless actions, which isn't actually that out of character. He's both an idiot and an asshole who is prone to repeating a lot of the same mistakes. This scene here, which is actually one of my favorite jokes in Family Guy, exemplifies exactly what I mean.
It's a stupid idea! You're a stupid man! A stupid, stupid man!
Ow! You're hurting me! Stop it! Stop it, Lois!
No! I'm so sick of your crap! Why do you always do these stupid things? And why do you always announce them to me before you do them?
And even if you don't agree that this isn't that out of character, you do need to remember that this is Modern Family Guy. The writers have long stopped giving a shit about writing characters purposefully and consistently, which is actually an issue I personally have with this series. But in this case, I don't mind it that much because it doesn't seem like they want me to take it seriously, and Peter being an asshole isn't a trait that I have difficulties imagining him having. To me, a lot of the appeal of this subplot comes from Quagmire's bitterly hostile demeanor towards Peter, even up until the very end. I certainly prefer Family Guy when it's not trying to be emotional or heartwarming, which is the main reason why I wasn't as into the Brian side of the story. Now, this might be an unpopular opinion, but I actually like Modern Brian. I know a lot of people really hate him and dislike how much he has devolved since his humble days in the earlier seasons. But honestly, I never liked Brian from those days. I always find him to be incredibly pretentious, and the reason why I like Modern Brian more is because I feel like the writers are more embracive of his more cunning personality traits that used to make him unlikable in my eyes, but now it makes him funny instead. It also improves his relationship with Stewie in moments where he calls him out on his hypocrisy or just simply points out the flaws in his character. So I was interested in seeing how this plot would develop, especially when it's bringing up a subject that the series has long ignored, which is Brian's relationship with his son. Unfortunately, later on, they did take this plot seriously, and via a forced and rushed moment of self-reflection and guilt on the part of Brian, which at that point, I didn't care anymore. That's one of the reasons why I don't like the series when it tries to be heartwarming, because it just doesn't work. I was actually glad when Brian stole the food in the studio in such an over-the-top way immediately after he felt bad for trying to take advantage of his son, which almost seemed like they were taking a piss at the idea of character growth. But then that's exactly what they went with, which is a shame, but whatever. I said this episode was underrated, not perfect. But now I want to get to the meat of the table, which is the suicide joke. Pretty infamous line that did not go well with a lot of people since we heard Meg explicitly instructing us how to commit suicide. Now, I don't think this joke is that funny, but I do think people have blown this way out of proportion. I see a lot of people call this a spiteful joke, and it could even inspire audience members to slit the wrist, but let's think critically. We first see Peter asking Lois pretty casually how he should go about killing himself. Now, this alone should already be enough for anyone to conclude that this isn't a scene that's meant to be taken seriously. Then later on, Meg responds also pretty casually by giving him the correct orientation, and Lois confirms this as well. This is very clearly an absurd scene. Aside from the abnormally lax nature of the parties involved, it's also taking a jab at the fact that Meg, who's been treated like shit in this family, would be knowledgeable on suicide, as she would probably have thought about doing it herself. You see, this, my friends, is called dark humor. This isn't uncommon with Family Guy. There's a little pedophile living in the neighborhood. Hell, this isn't uncommon in other shows or movies out there. Now, you don't have to think this is funny, which is completely fine, but you also don't have to take it so fucking seriously. Just because it's making a joke out of a real life issue, it doesn't always mean that you have to make a big deal about it. And the whole encouraging teenagers to commit suicide, look, this is an episode that garnered 4 million views, and it's been 6 years since it originally aired. Now, if you have some kind of statistics that proves that millions of teenagers kill themselves after seeing that episode, I might start to take you seriously, but so far I have yet to see any evidence that shows correlation between the existence of this episode and any number of suicide cases. Until then, you guys seriously need to stop acting as if this episode is more problematic than it actually is. Like, teenagers are not that fucking dumb. They're not just going to kill themselves solely because they saw a joke from Family Guy. Not to mention, I would actually argue that this episode discourages more than it incentivizes, because the person who wants to kill himself is an idiot, and we later saw a cutaway gag that implied that even if he ended up killing himself as a way to get attention, no one would end up remembering him in the future, rendering his plan completely pointless. Now, look, I don't want to be one of those guys who completely dismisses the idea of media being problematic, because I actually believe it can be, and I'm not opposed to even bringing up these discussions, but cases like these really do not help me get on board with it, because the biggest problem with these conversations is that everyone makes arguments based on hypotheticals. Because the idea of a teenager possibly depressed who ends up learning how to commit suicide via watching an episode of Family Guy and gets inspired to do it himself makes enough sense that it could happen, people just assume that it will, even on a large scale, and that's not how art works. I'm someone who believes that data needs to be present in order for these discussions to be taken more seriously, and before then, they're nothing more than assumptions. And I'm not going to morally shame a show for reasons that have never ever been proven to have taken effect. But hey, that's just my take on the matter. Brian is a Bad Father is a good episode, and if you disagree with me, then take Meg's advice. I'm joking, of course.